Welcome. In this third part of the introductory series, I will introduce the notion of how much there is still to be discovered in the personality of a replacement child so that they can live their own true lives. There's actually an urge to self-realization, says Carl Gustav Jung, in us human beings. And that is a great message of hope. Welcome to this part.
Shadow is not only that black and white picture I left you with before the break, but it's this picture I found on the internet, and it expresses for me quite well how a replacement child may feel maybe this much as their personality, but there is so much still to be discovered, the unlived parts of the personality. Everything that it doesn't know yet about who she or he is, the true self. And for me, the archetypal self is the force that is pushing through the suffering, through whatever symptoms, not just mental symptoms, but also symptoms in the body sometimes, a person towards self-realization. As I said, hope for an adult replacement child lies in the emergence of self. It's a transformation process, the individuation process, which is to regain that sense of inner wholeness. And for that, you do need to become aware of shadow. This is a beautiful also mandala painting of Jung. It's on the Journal of Analytical Psychology. And it's quite fitting because the way I could find it was only in this dark color initially. And it kind of shows you those darker aspects that we need to look at. We need to look at the taboo. We need to look at the death, the loss, the grief, the guilt, in order to get to self. And then I was lucky enough, as I was preparing for you this talk, to actually find the color version of this image to kind of illustrate that transformation that can take place. I don't know whether you have read the Red Book, but in the Red Book, there is a chapter, and that chapter is entitled Sacrificial Murder. And I chose not to bring that now. You can look at it. It's on page 232. In my version, it's entitled Sacrificial Murder. And here Jung describes that he sees a murdered child, a girl, and a voice tells him that he has to cut open the child and eat the liver. And frankly, I couldn't take it in. I went and I vomited. But the thing is, the liver is the seat of life. That goes also with his Liverpool dream that Sonu Shamdasani analyzes in the Red Book. And it's the thing to go back to life. And the way he writes in this dialogue is he has to do this, to take in the liver of that dead child in order for his soul to reveal himself to him. It is extraordinary. It's an extraordinary piece of reading. I let you go and have a look at it yourself. That is shadow, and I see that shadow in the connection with a replacement child. And as a necessary step to get to that more golden sense of wholeness, having looked at the darker side, because in that positive, in that tree still to be discovered are all the personality attributes, the qualities, even the images in the unconscious of a replacement child that are still to be discovered. Who said about two souls? Claudio, right? Said something about two souls. Adult replacement children can come to recognize that they were one and double, and understand why they may have to die to their old existence of being the replacement child in order to become whole, him or herself. Example of Jung. This is Al Mandala also in the Red Book. And he wrote here, the fire grasps the tree of life with all those big animals down here and the sort of destructive maybe aspect of fire, but giving essentially through that tree expression to this wonderful light, this mandala of light. And he wrote, the fire comes out of Muspili, it's a Nordic abode of the gods, and grasps the tree of life. A cycle is completed. A strange god, the unnameable god of the solitary, is incubating it. New creatures form from the smoke and ashes. So the fire can grasp and transform. Process of transformation that, in my view, became conscious for Jung in his dialogue with the images and the visions, including the sacrificial murder vision, that came from his unconscious and led to an experience of wholeness and of union, of the opposites. So replacement children can experience that kind of process, can be reborn into their own life. It's a rediscovery of their own true identity. And I would like to give you an example. That's a long story of Delphine in this book who did this cover. And previously to that cover, she made a painting. And you can see the two forces, right? You can see a huge dark force on the right and a smaller force with some red. Black and red can denote or symbolize life and death. And they are facing each other, right? And she looked at it at one point and said, well, they look almost like two little birds. And one item here in the middle, a third, is from which seems to emanate a lot of light, a fountain of light, golden light, that essentially makes this bigger still than the dark. And that is the process that Delphine had to live through. She had to realize A, the ambivalence to her mother, but B, that dark destructive force that was initially in her life and threatened her whenever a member of the family was ill or not well. And she had to see them as separate. And somehow the analytical process had to give more recognition and understanding or energy, if you wish, also to what was initially a smaller I. And that is a process that happened and happened well, but is often at transitional stages in a life can again become vulnerable or brittle. And as her husband became ill, with whom she had a rather ambivalent relationship, she felt that she had again to struggle to stay in her own life, to hold on to her own life, because she was going kind of back and forth between him and her, and it all became a bit of a muddle, like it had initially been with her sister, who was not there. So we were trying to differentiate, right? So recognize the two forces and then differentiate the two forces. So we had a session which I headlined as a session of transformation. And of course, I was teaching a little bit and sharing a bit. And I said, well, the self can compensate effectively chaotic conditions, which is a wonderful quote of Jung. The self compensates effectively chaotic conditions. It's in Collected Works 11, para 444. It's really my favorite one. And all is well, but she could not really hold on to the light. She had some eerie experiences of light in visions or in a dream, but she couldn't hold on to it in this difficult situation with her husband who was ill. I cannot gain enough distance from the dark force. She was pulled down. And then I was wondering how I could help to reconnect her and how I could get her out of being pulled down. And she shared with me, well, look, my mother took me to the grave of my little sister who bore the same first name as I did and made me pray to little X, which was me, but who was dead, who was down there. So you can feel exactly how that energy, and she's an adult woman in her early 70s now, is still active. And I asked her, what confusion did this cause for you? And she goes into a little girl voice and she says, you are me. but you're dead. But I ask you to pray for me. And then she switches back to the adult voice and says, you were always better off. I thought it was better to be dead. I thought it would be better if I were dead. I must delink from that prayer, that from that me being the other, which was instilled into me with the force of prayer. And I thought, that's great. And we had a moment of silence. And then she had an image. She says, I must construct a wall between her and me. She's behind and I'm in front. And I rejoiced, of course. You know, what a beautiful vision, what a beautiful image. Delineation, differentiation, delineation, separation. But she was not yet ready to let go of her sister. I can't let her go. I can't bury her, she cried. It is as if she needed me, as if a love linked us two. Now, how to undo that? I thought of that image of Macbeth. How do I do a sort of separation, a surgery of these Siamese twins, right? And we just stayed in that silence of the non-existence that she was pulled down by. And then at the end of the session, she burst into very short sentences. Okay, now I know. I know what I must do. If she doesn't want it, too bad for her. I must be me. Full stop. Go. I let you go. And that for me was a transformational moment, really, where she could connect with that lighter force, with the self, and be without the dark and the dead other, and be herself. But I would be lying to you if I would say that's the end of the story, because this will come again and again at a certain point in life. I saw her just the day before her 80th birthday, a few weeks ago. And she was again in the despair. And yet we could connect. I could see her, I could hear her, I could hold her, we could share silence, and she could reconnect. And it takes saying yes to the life force over and over again, and keeping it in consciousness over and over again. So this transformational process, which I was just showing you with that image of the Ouroboros, it comes and goes, and we have to choose again and again to see it and to let it happen and to let it unfold and to accept when we are in the dark and to wait for the light. Jung said, is there anything more fundamental than the realization this is what I am? And for a moment, I would like to focus on the what, because the what is the basis for who for Jung. And when I read this in the Psychology of Transference, it spoke to me. The what is the psyche itself as the unknown, unprejudiced object that has to be investigated. This process leads to a recognition by the ego that its foundation is rooted in a dimension other than the ego, in the self. And I continue the quote, it reveals a unity which nevertheless is or was a diversity. No longer the earlier ego with its make-believes and artificial contrivances, but another objective ego, which for this reason is better called the self. And in another passage, he says, no one can know himself unless he knows what and not who he is, on what he depends, or whose he is, and for what end he was made. So the what is neutral, not yet endowed with a personality, and by recognizing that strata to our being, that can inform the who with a true individual identity in the cases of replacement children or other cases where we were not allowed or seen to be who we are. So psychological rebirth becomes possible when a new sense of I is born out of the psyche from the self. A replacement child who did not know who he or she was and who has suffered from being someone else may discover that the self is constellated exactly under these difficult circumstances. That's what I call the silver lining. There is another reality that breaks in or that makes itself to be noticed. If we look, if we are sensitive, and if we are conscious and aware, and if we have a concept to understand this, because we need concepts. Individuation is a concept, self is a concept, but also the replacement child condition is a concept. If we are not familiar with it, we will not be able to recognize and understand it. Jung makes many references to sacrifice, death, and dying in the memories, dreams, and reflections, in the Red Book, in the collected works. But equally clear is his striving for self. Not after difference must you strive, but after your own being. At bottom, there's only one striving, namely the striving after your own being. If we do not distinguish, we fall into indistinctiveness and are given over to dissolution, into nothingness. The energy of the self is manifested in an almost irresistible compulsion, I quote Jung here, and urge to become what one is, to assume the form that is characteristic of its nature, no matter what the circumstances. Individuation is a mysterium conjunctionis, a metamorphosis or transformation which comes by way of transcending of the opposites to see the whole, and in these cases it is nothing less than the opposites of life and death from the very beginning. So I love this quote, which is from Jung, which is why we probably all went to this institute, or some of us did. The urge and compulsion to self-realization is a law of nature and thus of invincible power, even though its effect at the start is insignificant and improbable. The individuation process can help free adult replacement children from an unconscious identification or confusion with a dead person. So it becomes this indivisible unity, this wholeness is reached, at least from time to time. And for this, adult replacement children need to recognize that they were one and double, and to understand why they have to die to that old existence. And here is a quote from Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the author of Faust, and a man to whom Jung felt a great affinity. And so long as you have not attained it, this die and become, you will only be a gloomy guest on this dark earth. Don't you feel from my songs that I'm one and also two? It's a love song he wrote to his muse, and he refers, of course, to the ginkgo leaves, which are one and two.